3, 2, 1. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the starving mother and her child is precisely who motivates our side of the House. We think we're very much willing to trade off short-term pleasure like getting a check or getting some stimulus in order to really be able to rein in on inflation and debt and preserve the economy and society in the medium to long run. That was something clear from the top of this debate. I think side opposition, to a large extent, is a nuance to how monetary policy and central banks work. The fact that they have a chair like Jerome Powell, who is appointed by the office of the president and their administration, as opposed to necessarily being re-elected. I feel like to a large extent they argue about technocrats in general and a veto process in general for these particular financial regulation without clear nuance to how these things particularly affect debt and the effect of that on things like inflation to the economy. A couple of reasons why their side cannot take this debate. The first is, side opposition at best tries to cast a shadow of doubt in terms of there being a veto. At best, they question the capacity of the central bank and their chair to be able to make particularly good decisions, but don't necessarily give us a comparative or clear defense or accounting of status quo, which I think we were quite clear to characterize as also not being perfect, which precisely why we need an additional fetter in order to have an alignment of consistency between the levers of monetary policy that I told you in my speech that my partners also bolstered, and at the same time be able to help particular people in instances where we have to spend less and necessarily take austerity in order to prevent things like inflation from necessarily going haywire and as a consequence debt ballooning to a point where you no longer can repay. The second thing is burden fulfillment and the nuance to debt and how the central bank works. I think Tate and Matthew were quite clear wherein they ground the disinterest to people on the ground, middle-class individuals, small businesses, and the majority of people who, like we consistently POI'd, as not necessarily being the ones to be able to make a sound decision, precisely because of things like short-term thinking and hyperbolic discounting that lead to that mother precisely wanting that short-term paycheck and not necessarily understanding the short-term or medium-term pain that we have to go through with austerity in order to make sure our country doesn't get super cooked in the long run. The third is the idea of preemption towards opposition material. They talked about politicians being kind of ass, and we told you that that's exactly the point, right? Like the POI I raised. There's a difference between the Federal Reserve or monetary bank chair guy like Jerome Powell, who was appointed by the office of the president, as opposed to any kind of person in the legislative department like that of Congress or of Senate, who precisely are beholden to that supermajority of people who actually can push them through things like narratives and gerrymandering to be able to cater to their short-term interests. There are three metrics you have to use to be able to decide this debate. A, how exactly debt works and why necessarily in the long run we need to be able to rein in on that, which is precisely the whole point of the central bank. B, what exactly do central banks do and why exactly do we need an additional fetter in order to align what they're trying to do, which is control money supply, and at the same time also be able to make sure that society and economic policy follow suit and we don't necessarily just keep printing more money like that of quantitative easing. And lastly, in the long term, where are things more sustainable? Yes, we can also make mistakes, but at least we have an additional fetter to do things better. We are very proud to stand on side proposition.